Ben, welcome to Cinema, Life and Everything.
Hi Phil, how are you doing?
I'm good, mate. How are you?
Yeah, I'm really well. Yeah, I'm good. It's 4 p.m., so I've reached that point of the day where my brain is switching off. So if I can't find my words, forgive me. You'll probably have a very bad back at the end of this interview, carrying me. But
Oh, good little
we'll,
wrestling
we'll give it a
analogy
go.
there as well.
Yeah,
But yeah,
exactly.
before we get going, Ben, I would just like, obviously I did do a podcast previous to this, Slouching Towards Masculinity, and you appeared on that a couple of times. But just for like new viewers or new listeners, would you mind sort of explaining a little bit about yourself and what you do and what you're into?
No worries. Yeah. So, well, my day job, I suppose, is in photography and filmmaking. So, most of that is promotional films, social media films for businesses. Um, and in terms of the photography, I did do a lot of mixed martial arts photography, less so now. I mean, sort of COVID hit that and starting to get back up and running with that. So yeah, bits of mixed martial arts photography, and a podcast as well. So I run my own podcast called Squaring the Circle, which of
Tremendous
course you've been
podcast.
on. You've been
Yes,
on.
and awesome. Love listening to it as well. For anyone who's sort of like into creativity, positivity, and yeah, ways to think about the world and how to circumnavigate it. It's a lovely listen. I would highly recommend it. So
We have to say that, but thank you.
no, it's true. Can you imagine someone showed up on a podcast? You'd be, it's rotten.
Yeah, exactly.
My
Yeah,
word,
I
I
enjoy
can
it.
imagine. Right. So anyway, your three films of the day. I would love to hear what your three films are. I sort of know, but I guess the viewers, spoilers, unless I've changed again. So what are your three films of the
Can you imagine that? I'm just
day?
going to change them all. So the three films are It's a Wonderful Life. Not sure about the order, but yeah, It's a Wonderful Life, True Romance, and Brian and Charles.
The
Um,
last one being a real new film that I hadn't heard of at all and was blown away by. But yeah, sorry. Pick a starter then, and we can slowly work our way through the why.
no worries. Yeah, well, if we'll end with Brian and Charles maybe because that as you say that was a really recent film,
Mm-hmm.
and so it doesn't really sort of have the memories of the others that films do have, but I was completely blown away with it. So yeah, if we come to that last, then
Okay,
It's a Wonderful Life. Yeah, I
the
mean
classic.
it's an absolute classic. Yeah, yeah. It's quite cliche to have it in your top three, isn't it? But I always think. I mean, I'm quite a simple person, and my sort of definition of my favourite films are the ones that you can just rewatch every single year,
Yeah.
and still, take something from it, which and enjoy it basically. And of course, there's a lot of messages that run through that, the timeless messages that will always. I think there's always going to be a popular film,
Mm.
just because, yeah, it doesn't matter what kind of mindset you're in, it it does something for you. So, for instance, I've seen this film where potentially things weren't going too great, and you can come out of that film with feeling slightly more positive about things. You can reframe your thinking to a certain
Mm.
extent, but also on the flip side, you can come into it thinking or feeling really positive about life and about how things are, and that's just going to put the cherry on the top of the cake, isn't it? So
Yeah.
it's really nice in that way. It's sort of a universally you get something from it, whatever you take into it. And I think it was Mark Commode, and he probably got it off someone else. He's always saying that what you get out of films is what you take into them,
Mm.
in terms of how you're feeling. And It's a Wonderful Life is a great example of that, I think.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it, actually, because I think, yeah, like you say, the viewer will always be changing. So every time is sort of there's that saying that I can't remember. I'm with some stoic person was like, a man never steps into the same stream twice because it's not the same stream and it's not the same man. And I
Yeah,
think like watching a film as well, you're going to come at it with different life experiences, so you'll probably take different bits from the film as well. But I was always surprised to learn when Wonderful Life, It's a Wonderful Life was first released, it actually didn't do well in the cinema at all. It's only when it went to sort of public service TV and was shown every Christmas that it just become this massive hit and this feel-good film that people will go back to again and again, a timeless classic, so to speak.
Yeah, it was totally panned when it first came out,
Mm.
which is similar. It reminds me actually of Shawshank Redemption, not in terms
Mm.
of the content or anything, but that was completely panned when it first came out, and it was, well, maybe it wasn't panned, but it wasn't commercially successful
Yeah,
in the slightest. And yeah, it's exactly the same thing, which is really strange, isn't it? Because you could watch this film, you say, well, why would people dislike that? Why wouldn't that engage the audience? So yeah, it's just a really, but then that often happens, isn't it? There's a
subjective.
this is sort of slightly niche, but there's a photographer called Robert Frank who is a street photographer. He released a photo book called The Americans in the late 50s, early 60s. At the time, critics completely panned it. So they said it was a death of photography, and now it's held up as the iconic street photography photo book, just like 50 years later. So yeah, things change, don't they? But it's very strange how, considering how kind of mainstream the messages are within the film, um, that it wasn't critically acclaimed and commercially a real success. I could have explained it slightly more or understood it slightly more if the messages and the storyline was really kind of out there,
Mm.
and kind of pushing the boundaries. But it's quite a fluffy film, really. There's not too much to dislike, which is a bit strange.
I think that I like all these good pop songs that have slightly dark lyrics. The idea that you deal with the fact that if he wasn't born at all, or like didn't exist, and how all these other people sort of fall down around it, you see quite a dark side of what could have been. And so, for such a feel good film, it does have its moments of quite like introspective and dark, but again it has the feel good ending, but it's still like for such a feel good film, it does lead you down quite a dark path for some time, I always feel.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, it's if we think about the sort of the darkest part, the villain,
Mm.
which oh, that's good, isn't it? What's his name? Hang on, we can edit this out. Hopefully,
Don't
you hear
worry.
us in this.
Don't worry. You don't know. You don't. I always forget people's names and stuff as
Yeah,
well.
I'm terrible. I'm absolutely terrible with it. Bear with me. It's completely escaped me.
Don't worry. Don't worry. I've got it here as well.
Mr. Potter. There we go.
Mr. Potter.
Mr. Potter. Yeah. So if we think about Mr. Potter,
Mhm.
um, I did remember the name.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's incredibly dark, and not in the sort of a superhero, um, outrageous villain, but it's just the
Mm.
way he speaks to people, just the way he looks down on people. And again, of its time, 1946, he really cut through as a villain, and the sort of darkest parts are centered around him, and that's why I think that's why it works sort of long term, this film, because it's got the archetypes, but the archetypes are used so well,
Mm.
um, that yeah, you just sort of settle in. Like as soon as like the first 5 minutes hit, you just settle in for another couple of hours where you know what's going to happen, but the characters are written so well and so perfectly that you're in good hands, basically.
And incredible acting as well. Like
Yeah,
it's, I think sometimes people take that sort of style of acting, the fact it's such a classic film for granted, but it still takes a lot to tell that tale with such like clarity and such poise. And it's a classic for a reason. There's nothing really clunky about it. Everything has been measured, and like you say, the message is universal and for all time. Really, it doesn't really run down the value of life, the appreciation of your meaning and your worth, and how it's weighed against if you weren't there. What the
yeah.
difference that even somebody who doesn't feel worthy, like what would the world be like? Everybody's important, basically. Everybody
Yeah.
has value and worth.
And I think in this day and age where social media is always pushing
Yeah.
success, and to whatever success looks like. Is it making 1 million, 2 million? Is it buying the fast car and everything? So all this sort of background noise of what success looks like, actually, It's a Wonderful Life brings it back to, well, success is living and sort of interacting with everybody, and making that impact in your own small little way.
Yeah, exactly. And do you feel like we've mentioned it a little bit already, but you come back to this film quite regularly. Do you feel that you get different lessons from it, or is it like a reassurance or a reaffirming of what you believe, or is it just like almost like a warm bath that you can just put it on and it's sort of background noise?
Yeah, it's a warm bath. That's probably a nice way to look at it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I
Is
think that the nice thing is I'll continue to watch it every year, and as we said at the very start, depending on what's happening in my life, I'll absolutely take different things um, to that film. Definitely.
do you have a standout scene in it at all, or is it just the very ending, or is it hard to pick it
I
apart?
love the scene. I love the scene just after, well, in the pub scene.
Yeah.
The pub scene is and I won't, for anybody who hasn't seen it, I won't spoil it, but it's a really impactful scene. And yeah, I think that's the part of the film where this kind of the rhythm of the film is completely set up, and then it's just a sort of downhill to the ending. Then
Yeah.
that's also the sort of trigger moment, isn't it, to a certain extent? But yeah, the scene in the pub, absolutely love it.
It's just, yeah. I mean, when you pick that one, I'm glad, because I think sometimes it can get to a point where people, I don't know, sort of try and second guess themselves a little bit with their choices, and they want the ones that are critically acclaimed, or
Right.
have that
Mm.
certain weight behind them. But there's nothing wrong with picking just a classic for the sake that it is a classic, and a feel good film for the sake it's a feel good film. That I'd say when I rewatched it, I'd forgotten how dark it was in places, and how it doesn't need to show you, but it can suggest that there's a lot of, if you hadn't existed, there was a lot of bad stuff that could have happened.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So okay, so from It's a Wonderful Life, where would we like to? Oh, we're going to end, so I know. So okay, I guess we were talking about it feels like a warm bath. Well, there is a bathroom moment in True Romance, but it's not a
Mm.
warm and fluffy one at all. And that's the idea of
What a
James
great
Garner
segue.
phoning. That's a terrible segue.
No, it's a good segue. I respect that segue.
So yes, True Romance, an absolute banger, and written by Quentin Tarantino, but directed by Tony Scott, and
Yeah.
very randomly for a Quentin Tarantino film, or it's the only one of its type that was actually re-edited and directed in chronological order. So as it wasn't originally written. So yeah, why True Romance? And again, an absolute classic.
Yeah, it is. It's a really good question, and I probably should have prepared loads of things to say. But just so starting with why True Romance. Well, why is it that I can watch it and watch it and watch it, and
Mm,
you can obviously start at the point with the way it's written. It's really tightly written, but that's Tarantino, and it was sort of Tarantino potentially before he knew if he probably didn't speak about himself in the third person at this point. Whereas,
yeah.
so he didn't know himself that well, which I think is brilliant for this film, because it's just talent on the page. Basically, there's no thought about commercial success or anything like that. It's just this is what I want to write, basically, and how cool is this script going to be? And that's um, I just think there's so much style to this film, not only in the script, not like the simple directing. Tony Scott doesn't pretend to do sort of anything spectacular. It's kind of by the numbers direction to a certain extent. The performances he gets from the actors is great, but there's no outlandish sort of spots or anything like that. The whole film is just there's a great pace to it. The characters are perfectly played, and you want to go on that journey with them, because it's a kind of road movie, action movie. It's funny at times when it needs to be funny. It's completely brutal at times, with that that bathroom scene. That's
Yeah.
just horrific. Um, but there's a light touch to it. Even in another brutal scene, where Dennis Hopper is in his trailer. You know, that's but I mean, that's sort of been done to death in terms of film school. You know, screenwriting 101, how that's put together. But even that's a, you know, really horrible scene. But that's got its light bits because of the chemistry on screen. So yeah, and of course Christian Slater is incredible and so perfectly cast as well. I think because if he was any better looking, you wouldn't believe it, and if he was any worse looking, you wouldn't believe it. Like he's just, it's that casting is perfect. Because, like I said, if he didn't fit that kind of everyman, that the chemistry with Patricia Arquette just wouldn't have worked as well, because you wouldn't believe it. You would have been taken out of that film too quickly. But between the two, like she needed a certain man, and obviously he was in a spot of his life where he needed a woman, actually any woman, but it just so happened that she was a looker. So
it's just, I think one of the things that hit me the most when I was rewatching it was, and it's such a strange thing to say, but the opening credits, when all the names of the people in the film come up, and you're just like, I always remember there's a lot of stars in it, but it's actually an insane cast. Like even like a bit part, like the flatmate who has about 8 lines. Oh, that's Brad Pitt. Like it's just an Michael Rapport. It's just Rappaport. Sorry, it's just an unbelievable cast. Michael Madsen, Chris Penn. It's just like, for instance, just a couple of scenes, almost a cameo, but just from wall to wall, and it almost being like a critique of Hollywood at the same time. Tarantino back at that point trying to break into Hollywood and basically just writing about what he knew, what he loved, what his passions were. And I think it's, like you say, as he's moved on, he's more gone into his influences, but I think this is one of the more purer and distilled versions of Tarantino. It's almost a bit autobiographical, with probably some flourishes of the life he would have wanted to leave or the life that he wanted to happen to him as well. It's an astonishing film.
Yeah, it's so raw. The whole thing is so raw, and I think that if Tarantino had written this 5 years later, then that rawness might have sort of come away from it potentially, or even 10 years later, because as I said, there was a seemingly a naivety at the very start where he just didn't give a shit, and that's where his best work was.
Yeah.
Now, and I'm not, you know, I'm the first one to say that Tarantino, the one thing he has needed since then, I know he didn't direct this, but when he was a director, is a good editor, because you could always shave 20 minutes, half an hour for films. But that, you know, but at this time when he was just writing, it was and of course the script would have been edited, but it was just a sort of seemingly like a stream of consciousness, but in the Tarantino way, because no one speaks in the way that he does his script at all. I mean, no one's that intelligent. You don't get 15, 20 people that are that intelligent that can just have those conversations. But it's just, it's incredible. And the going back to sort of the way it's made, like I mentioned the directing, but the editing is, again, there's no exceptional editing techniques. It's just storytelling 101. It's brilliant. It's just doing the basics. It's world-class basics, I think, that film.
It's just the propulsiveness of it as well. I actually own the special edition on DVD, and it's always interesting to watch the alternate ending, which we'll get to in a little while, and the deleted scenes. And some of the deleted scenes are extra stuff with Chris Penn and Michael Madsen, and also we've got the scene with another scene with Christopher Walken. But as good as they are, they're standalone. Another one with Brad Pitt as well, but they're not needed. They're, as little curios, they're lovely to watch and see a little bit more of a flourish in it being acting. But I think maybe almost having that other director that wasn't like loved the script, but obviously wasn't precious about it, would be like, this isn't necessary. We can lose this. We can lose this. We can actually put it into chronological order. And I think in some ways it's got all the sparks and the witticisms, and like you say, that amazing conversational style, the conversation you would have, not the one you think about, oh, that's the one would have had 10 minutes after the conversation had ended. but it's all in there, but then another hand is guiding it. So it's lovely to see Tarantino's words being directed by another hand.
Yeah, it's a good way to look at it, actually. Definitely. I mean, there's I think this is sort of a wider point about films, but one of the, and probably I shouldn't look at it like this, but one of the first things I look at is running time. And I know we've had lots of
Mm,
discussions, not on a podcast, but just having a coffee and a chat down the beach, but about running time and being and killing your darlings in terms of scenes, because there's very few films that can't be told in an hour and a half, an hour and 45, in my opinion. Now, of course, there are films that are incredible at 2 hours and incredible at 2.5, but I think there has to be a special reason for that. So yeah, this was at the time where um, I don't think any time could be shaved off this. I think it's a perfect
mm.
edit, especially looking at all the scenes that got cut off, because they were nice scenes, but then as a director, you come back to that central question: does this add to the story? And if not, well, it has to go. And that's something potentially Tarantino, and I'm sure he'll be devastated to hear that what I think about him, what he hasn't done recently.
I would completely agree as well, and I don't know if that's something that's happening with Hollywood quite a lot at the moment. But when I pop to the cinema now, I'm exactly the same. I'll go on IMDb or something and go, actually, what is the running time of this? And I don't know if films are trying to be made to feel more of an event, and the idea of if a film is an epic running time, suddenly it becomes epic by default. But I agree with you. Not that I've got a short attention span, but when you're going into films now that are all breaking 2.5 hour running time, it's like, what are you doing? It's sort of like, are they trying to compete with the binge watching of a series and trying to have that level, or do they feel that if they don't have that much characterization in a film, but yeah, as important as the point you're making is to make it precisely and concisely.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you lose so much in just this a massive, scenes become less standout if they're surrounded by a lot of fluff. That's a real big
Yeah,
problem at the moment.
absolutely. But it is. I tell you what's strange about running times is that everybody's saying that attention spans are going down and down and down and down and down, which they probably are. However,
Mm,
depending on where you're consuming your media. Yet Hollywood, I would argue that the last sort of 5 years, the big blockbusters have got longer. So
yes.
and I'm sure that they've done their research about attention spans and what happens to people. So there must be some sort of science behind it. But it's just strange that how you would have thought that the running times would be getting shorter, not longer, with the world we're living in.
It is interesting, and one thing that I have seen quite a lot recently, it really harms me as well. It started with horror films that seem to be making quite a big comeback, but there seems to be more and more of those mid-budget 90-minute running times actually being produced now, which I'm a big fan of. Like, I saw one about the Musketeers the other day, a French film, and it's the first part of a 3-part series, but which again that will have a lot. But that was pretty much just under, I think it was like 145, and it was beautiful, and it cracked along, and I'm like, that is perfect. I don't know. Do you feel this when you see a running time and it is sticking to that 90-minute 145 running time? It's like, this is a director, or this is a tale that knows what it needs to be. There's no, it's been thought about and produced in such a way, we're going to get you in, you're going to tell you the tale, we're going to get you out, and there's no spare fluff here. We know the point we need to make. We don't need to sort of go around the houses, so to speak.
Yeah, I think I would totally agree. I mean, of course, there's the argument that if you're going to limit yourself too much and think, right, well, this has got to be 90 minutes or whatever, it can
Mm,
limit the creativity involved. However, speaking for myself, I know that if I've got a framework to work within, I'm more creative. That actually
yeah.
gives you that platform to be creative, rather than this open-ended sort of running time that could be this, could be that. Oh, do we need this? Do we need that? So yeah, I think that sort of working backwards from the running time is quite um, is quite crucial. Really, the only sort of, again, thinking off the top of my head, going back on myself, is that when I see, so one at like 90 minutes, in my opinion, is perfect. 1 hour 45, great. If I see kind of 1 hour 20, I think, oh, this is too low budget then. So I can't be.
Nah.
So who knows really?
I got sorry, it's horror. I know not everyone loves horror, but there was one called Host,
Yeah,
come out
yeah,
a little
yeah,
while, and it was all based around a Zoom call.
yeah,
So I believe I think they had the pro package. So I think it was a 60-minute film.
yeah,
And of course, the film's going to end when the Zoom call hits its time limit. And I was like, that's brilliant. So
yeah,
when
yeah,
and like the first part of Dune, the remake of it, I mean, that's a long, long film. But I felt really enraptured by it. If it's an
hmm,
epic, the extended versions of Lord of the Rings, when they've got stuff to put in there and it's worthy and it all connects, it's great. It's just like I say, there's been a few films that I've seen where I'm like, okay, that was a good scene, but I especially don't like it when characters go on a quest and say at the end of the 30 minutes, it didn't you realize that didn't really have a point to it. It was just
hmm,
something that characters needed to go and do to fill up a bit of running time in the script, and I'm a bit like, don't I'm not going to name and shame, but I was a bit like,
yeah,
oh.
yeah, 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 yeah. It happens. It
It
happens.
happens. So, in terms of favorite scenes in True Romance, and this is a real tough one because
Oh,
a lot of
blimey.
like Tarantino films are just a collection of amazing scenes, all well
Yeah.
stuck together. Do you have a favorite one there? Is it the Christopher Walken or?
I do love that scene. I love I love the slightly understated scenes as well. There's a scene quite near the beginning where they're also on a first date, really,
Yes,
and they have the apple pie, and then the sugar goes into the drink, and it just keeps on going and going, and just yeah. So that I love sort of the get to know each other scenes like that. There's the amazing Gary Oldman scene,
oh, yeah.
and again, no spoilers when he sort of first pops up. I just get for a few minutes, but that sort of goes back and speaks to how much how good the script must have been for all these actors. And yes, some of them were at that point that weren't A-listers, but they were still big names that they
Mm.
wanted to attach themselves, even if they were in a small role. So yeah, so there's that, obviously there's a bathroom scene which is incredible, the shootout scene
Oh,
amazing,
yeah.
because although it's you could call it a kind of action movie, there's not that much really, but then it just goes completely ballistic at the end. Um, yeah, so many. I mean, I think I've listed 4 or 5 there, just so that
But
it's
no, it's fair enough. I mean, I was going to say one that you've not even mentioned, which is anything with Val Kilmer playing the silhouette of
yeah,
Elvis, which I absolutely adore. Even though you never see him fully, he's
yeah,
just a blur. I think he personifies Elvis so well, and just
mm,
you get
mm,
it, or you get all that you need to get from Christian Slater's reactions, which I just think is a beautiful, beautiful moment in those films as well. I just I think even though, like you say, there is some horrific violence in there, there's this lovely, actually sort of quite like A Wonderful Life in a while. There's a lovely fairy tale quality about it, underpinned by terrible, terrible things happening to
yeah,
quite nice people, really. But yeah, this idea of like, where dreams can come true, but it's just with a
yeah.
suitcase full of cocaine and yeah, and a lot of people dying because of it.
But I think that's why it works, isn't it? I mean, the drama is based in contrast, isn't it? And you've got the contrast of what's actually happening on screen and the actual message of the movie, which is a love story.
Yeah.
That love conquers all, essentially. So you've got this two huge sort of concepts battling one another for screen time, which is why it's so engaging. I think.
I would be remiss if I didn't actually mention the alternate ending. I'm sorry if you've not seen it. Go and watch it. Too much now. But the alternate ending, which is featured on the DVD of which seems to be a big thing in a lot of Tarantino films, where he likes to have these sort of bleakish endings, where Christian Slater's character doesn't make it. He dies in the shootout. How did you feel about that? I've watched both endings. I'd love to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, not for me. Not for me. I like
Mm,
I like I like my fairy tales with nice endings. Thank you. Life is shit enough sometimes without um with good people dying. So no, I much prefer. I'm glad they didn't go for the alternative ending, um, because yes, potentially it would have been more realistic for him to die and things. But no, the main thing with films is you're rooting for people, isn't it?
yeah,
And you're absolutely rooting for those two. You want them to sail off into the sunset with that briefcase. So yeah, I didn't have too much time for the alternative ending.
I completely agree, and it's funny. I listened to a podcast with Tarantino a while ago, and he hated it at the time because he had to sell his script to sort of get money for Reservoir Dogs and stuff, and he didn't want that ending. He was really sort of like bitter with Tony Scott for a while about it, but then he said he watched it a little while after and was like, no, he completely needed it. I
Yeah.
think with Patricia Arquette getting that beating, Dennis Hopper having to die, they were really adrift. And yeah, that extra step of having to kill Christian Slater so then she would be all right. She had the money, she was alone, and she had his child. But come on, give him a break.
Yeah. If it, and that's the thing. I think that's a really good point, actually. The amount of beatings and death that and obstacles they sort of got over, and then for him to die at the end, it'd be like, well, I'd be thinking, well, what's the point? Why have I followed that story? Why
Yeah,
have I rooting for? There was never going to be a sequel or anything like that. So it's just a standalone story, um, and yeah, just the traditional man in me, I suppose, thought, yeah, no, let's have a happy ending. Why not?
do you think as well sometimes is that mistake that some that like I don't know directors or writers make, that if something has a bleak ending, it becomes more affecting, so then it becomes more memorable. But then you actually run the risk of making it just like misery porn. So it's just bleak things happening to bleak people, and it's a bleak ending, and just people walk out. And you get that gut punch, and it becomes memorable because. But it's not a good. Sometimes, like you say, sometimes why there's nothing wrong with being happy. There's nothing wrong with nice.
Yeah, yeah, of course. I'm never ever. I'm not going to sit here and say that every ending for every film has to be, a nice ending, because
Yeah,
that would be really really boring. But it simply comes back to the film.
yeah,
What does that film need? How does this film need to end? Now, if it does need a dark ending, and that is aligned with everything that's gone before, absolutely, that's good film. That's good storytelling. If, however, um, they just for the gut punch, they change it up just for the cheap win, basically. Well, that doesn't do anything for me. It's a bit like when filmmakers do a twist at the end that you've got
oh
no idea, or you've been given no clues. It's just a twist out of nowhere. Well, that's really cheap because anybody can do that. Now, if there's a twist at the end where you can follow the crumbs back, you think, it was there all along. Well, that's clever filmmaking. So it's the same
yeah.
kind of thing.
I have to talk to you sometime about my proposed musical ending to Seven. It was a real winner. I think it would have really helped the film at the end not be so bleak. But no, I was going to say, so from Clarence and oh
Alabama.
Alabama, geez, riding off into the sunset, we
Yeah.
should have Brian and Charles in their camper van riding into the horizon, like in an absolute right, so quick accountability thing here, or a bit of backstory to the
Yeah.
watchers and listeners. The original choice was Napoleon Dynamite.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
have on DVD, absolutely adore it. Incredible film. Quote it to myself all the time just to make myself laugh. And but then you switched it up and you said, "Oh, I've got this Brian and Charles." It was on Netflix. I'd missed it on Netflix. I went and got it on Amazon, and I was like, as soon as it started up, it was just, I watched a little bit of the trailer, but I don't want to spoil it. I was like, "What?" It's like it's done in a documentary. It's very strange. This is the one I don't want to spoil too much because it's very fresh and I would love people to go and watch it rather than hear us talking about it, first of all. But what an absolute winner of a film. I mean, I can sometimes, people don't want to pick something too new because it's like, oh, okay, is this going to stand the test of time? But this one particularly like leapt out the screen at me, completely enraptured for the whole of its running time. So yeah, why I know why, but why this one?
Yeah. So this was an interesting one, as you say. I had Napoleon Dynamite. I mean, I wanted to choose two that I go way back and one that was slightly more recent.
God, yeah.
Napoleon Dynamite, weirdly, is just one of those films. There's some classic films that you haven't seen, or you're always putting off because there's always something new. Anyway, watched that, loved that, so put that on the list. And then I just saw this quaint little British film, and I don't know. It really stayed with me. And yeah, there's going to be no spoilers because it really is new. So don't want
Mm.
to absolutely spoil it. But there's not too many spoilers really. I mean, it's a love story, isn't it? It's a
Yeah,
love. It's a dysfunctional love story. But what I loved about it is it was subtle, it was gentle, but most of all, it was brave. It was brave filmmaking,
Yes. It's a lovely way
because
of putting it. Yeah.
it was that, yeah, the direction was really clear. There was a real clarity to the script. The director obviously knew the characters inside and out. Um, yeah, it was just sort of subtle brilliance. That's how I sort of would see it. But really funny as well. But not in a sort of a slapstick way, although there's a couple of slapstick bits at the end, which is a great, finale. Um, but yeah, great writing. How you can warm to this robot. And the main protagonist as well, um, Brian, of course. So
Yes.
yeah, it's yeah, I was really affected with it. I sort of caught myself about 50 minutes in, just sort of smiling, and I'd just been smiling for pretty much from minute one, because it was so heartwarming, but not in a really obvious kind of um and not in a really obvious kind of way. It's in a sort of a
No.
subtle way.
It's very measured, and like you say, I always love those films where it's not, it doesn't force you to feel. Like
Mm,
it's very odd. It's done it like I say in that documentary style, and I love the little looks to the cameras that don't feel forced, because the documentary thing has been going on quite big ever since The Office and stuff
yeah,
now. And but just the way, like you say, the realization of the characters, and they don't need to say everything. They don't need to give all their backstories, but you can just tell that Brian has he's had a sad life, and but he loves his inventions, and he loves being a creator, and just his little looks every now and again when he realizes his loneliness. But then when things start to happen, like there's a real, like, I think this really, after you mentioned it to me, I watched it and thought about It's a Wonderful Life, and indeed True Romance, these real sense of magic that
yeah,
play through all three things, that good things can happen, and in a way, if you're religious, miracles or magic can happen. And
mm,
there's
mm,
this magic. And the thing I love about Charles as well, is a real crap looking robot,
yeah,
but there's just
exactly.
something wonderful in that as well. It reminded me weirdly of Patrick Moore. I don't know why,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, totally. But everything in that film would have been workshopped to within an inch of his life, in terms
yeah.
of everything, like the wardrobe design for the robot and everything, and everything is just so, everything is aligned. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's the magic, because um, if you're not engaged in a film, you look out for anything that's unrealistic, and you think, oh well, that's that and that's that and that, and you just lay excuse upon excuse why you don't like the film. If you do like a film, you make an excuse to like it, and you're so engaged with this film that, yes, of course, it doesn't make any sense in terms of he he invents a robot, and it's and it's got this kind of emotional intelligence. Um, so it doesn't make any sense, but it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. And even, and it's so, in some ways, it's so structured in terms of when the other love interest comes into
Mm,
play. That how it's kind of going to end up. But even the ending is, there's a little twist on the ending about how you, yeah, how all, well, I'm not going to give the ending away, but
mm,
what I will say is the ending is not quite as structured or obvious as you would think.
yeah.
And just, yeah, just a tiny little, always in films, isn't it? Those small details make the details of the wider sort of piece of art, and this is a perfect example of that. It's yeah, yeah, it's great. I love it.
And I think for such an indie film, such one that was obviously filmed on a budget,
Yeah,
that sense, it goes to show that you don't need the $300 million budget, and that's something I'm very a big fan of as well. The art, there's no higher or low art, and there's no real high budget or low budget art. If something is enchanting, if something has a story to tell, and it is a completely enchanting film, that you can't look away, you don't want to pause it, you want to stay in it. And I think the same thing for me. I got about 50 when the antagonist is introduced, and you realize, and it's just like, you really care. You really don't
yeah,
want
yeah.
things to go wrong, and you want him to get a win in this life, and that's what's so important. If I can feel that, if you've hooked me emotionally, then I'm in now. I want to see it through.
But that's another perfect example, isn't it? Because the cheap win to that film would, again, without spoiling it, would be to for potentially Charles to meet his maker, or for him not to be around. And that really would be a gut punch
Yeah.
because he's genuinely likable. However, no, this is the story that we want to tell, and we're going to go in a slightly different direction and be brave with that, and sort of stand behind our decision, but but still not copping out or anything, because it certainly has its moments of
Yeah.
bittersweetness and things. So
Yeah, that's it. Nothing feels forced, and there's no sense of compromise there, but not creating ultra aggression or getting something really disturbing going
yeah,
on for the sake of it. And I think that even if we sort of step back a little bit into True Romance, there are some scenes in that are obviously very, very disturbing, but in that universe,
yeah,
it's established that those things can happen, and you sort of need to see them because it juxtaposes with the fairy tale quality of Clarence and Alabama. That yeah, but you're tap dancing through this life gracefully, but just underneath the surface there are sharks waiting to grab you, and they'll do wicked things. And yeah, I think they do that. Even you don't need to see true wickedness in Brian and Charles, but there's that threat there that things could go wrong, and you care. You
yeah,
really
yeah,
really care.
yeah. It's brilliant. I can't wait. I always, if I loved a film, I never watch it straight away after. I always give it at least a few months to sort of let it marinate and then come back to it. I'm really looking forward to um, seeing it again, because there was such craft with the filmmaking. There's definitely going to be stuff that I just didn't notice before. So yeah, I'm looking forward to watching it again.
I think I was going to ask you about your favorite scene if it's not a spoiler, but I was just going to say as well, this is in the trailer, it's in the first like 2 minutes of the film, but there's a sort of like hyper montage of him revealing a lot of his a lot of his other a lot of his other inventions
Yeah,
that are just brilliant. And the special one about this, he's made a plane basically that he's going to tell people the time on, and the punchline to that, I was, it takes a lot, I think, to get me to have to pause the film because I was rolling up so much. But just the quick edit and then how that ends, and I was like, oh, you've won me. This
yeah,
film, if that's the best bit of the film, this film has already got like a five
yeah.
star review for me. But without,
Absolutely.
do you have like a favorite bit in it at all, that without a spoiler, or is it?
Favorite scene? I'd probably have to watch it again actually,
Mm.
because I've literally just seen it once. Um, there was a bit where again towards the end, where one of the inventions is used against a villain, which again is so sort of, if you disliked the film before that, that would have been the nail in the coffin, because you're at that point you're just with it. You're just
Yeah.
like a cheerleader for this lovely little film, so they could do anything. So yeah, it would be that was a great scene where the villain um, gets his comeuppance, I think.
It's just the universal themes of love,
Yeah,
and it,
yeah,
just getting seen to like everyone has that their bit in life of the bully or the authoritarian,
yeah,
and just like have it, wanting the underdog to win, and just like I say, just that script was just perfect. It
yeah.
was just there's not, again, not a spare moment, not a dud line. Every look to the camera is done perfectly and established perfectly. So it's brilliant.
Absolutely. And while we are on air,
Go on
I'm
him.
going to see what the running time is, because
Ah, no,
I
that's a very good.
reckon
I
there we
think it's
go.
about 90 minutes, right?
1 hour 30 minutes
But
on the nose. So
bang
there we
on. Because going back to running time, there is something as well. I know I've heard there's a couple of Jim Cameron films which maybe sometimes, bless him, he does need the slight edit. But and honestly, Terminator 2, the special edition, is my favorite version, one of my favorite films of all time. But I know films certainly have to be cut sometimes to fit into that, and not so much now, but back in the day, because we need to get so many showings on in a cinema in a day, so it has to be this time. And I agree. Sometimes, if it isn't, if that you see those extra scenes, if there's a director's cut and it's re-established, and you're like, actually, that works either way, but I prefer it with the extra scenes. It just adds that little bit more nuance to it. But yeah, I just think that, not, what would you say for you? Your understanding of it. It's not being precious about your work. I'm always reminded of a Stephen King quote in one of his books when it was called On Writing, when he goes back to his manuscript and straight away just rips 10% of it out, no matter what, just anything that's not story, just get rid of it. Do you think that sparseness and leanness always needs to be seen in a script?
Yeah, and it's the most difficult thing, which is why you need a trusted couple of people or a team to
Mm,
look at it with fresh eyes, because there's just no way of doing it otherwise. Because you you know, when you're writing things and creating things, you form that emotional connection, and but then if you're just doing the editing, if you're just doing the editing too,
mm,
well, it's absolutely impossible, because you're just not
yeah.
going to work. So you need that person to say, "Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that?" Um, in my opinion, anyway.
Would
Um,
you? Oh, sorry. I was going to say, would you say about like a long editing process? Because I know edits in Hollywood have really been cut back now in that race to get stuff on the screen again. How long does an edit take typically for you, or do you like give it to someone else to have a look at as well? Is it something you formulate over a long time, or is it something you just sort of try and get through?
yeah,
It's very dependent.
it's a great question. I mean, I've just read the new Rick Rubin book about
I've got that
creativity.
downstairs to read actually on creativity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's brilliant, and he talks about the editing process, and if in an ideal world, you take as long as it takes. However, obviously
Mm,
there's deadlines. So my sort of rule of thumb is, if I'm filming for a day, this is on the sort of commercial side rather than narrative. If I'm filming for a day, an edit will take 2 days.
right.
Now it may take one day. However, it may take 3 days.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because now of course you've got to hit a deadline most of the time, but the and because every single project is totally different in terms of the process, because you might smash through the first version, and then come to a roadblock when it comes to music, or you may get the music straight away and you can't quite get the rhythm right or the structure right, so you have a complete rejig. But one of the things that Rick Rubin says is, if you can, and I totally agree with this, is that if time affords you, come away from the project and keep doing something else creative, and just let your subconscious work on it. And it's funny, isn't it? Because I was reading that and I was thought, it was something that I kind of knew, but it was nice having it in writing. And if it works for Rick Rubin, it's going to work for me. And I was working on a film. It was a sort of a narrative film for a project, and I something wasn't quite right. It was something in the structure wasn't quite right, and so I took myself away. And then I was washing up, and then I can remember it like it was, well, it wasn't that long ago, but like it was yesterday. And there's like a voice in my head saying, "Put the third section before the second." Um, and then that was it. And then I did that, made the whole difference. And then the edit from then on, perfect. And then it just made all the difference in terms of the rhythm, in terms of structure, and it made that film, that little piece. So yeah, it's I don't even know what your question was, but
No, that's a beautiful insight into it about like what basically the idea of editing and how
yeah,
to get you answered it basically how to get the rhythm and the structure right, and that's I often say I try and find the commonalities between the physical and the mental, and the biggest changes to the body happen in the recovery times when you're not actually in the gym. It's when you're resting,
yeah,
and I
yeah,
think
yeah,
maybe
yeah, yeah.
there's sort of like a mental workout happening, and then like you say, step away from it, and you just yeah, then that's when your brain goes, oh, okay, now I can recover and now I can give you the answer you seek. So that,
Yep, yep.
man, I can't wait to
It
read
was
that
the
book.
It was, yeah, it's a great book, and just sort of following on from that as well, is that pretty much my first ever short film I did, um, that sort of the end. So I had pretty much 90% right, but the end just wasn't landing. I just was, going back and forth, and nothing was right.
Mm.
And then I remember I was brushing my teeth, and then a little voice came into my head saying what the twist was at the end, and that was that, done. So it's just incredible. And so if you can, yeah, if you don't have a deadline to hit, just give it time, and then um, yeah, it will work itself out.
That's just a lovely way of looking at it. It's like also, don't know why this keeps popping into my head, but when you try and remember before the days of like IMDb and stuff, when you'd see an actor or something or an actress in a film, and you'd be like, I know them. What have I seen them in? And like 2 days later, like you say, you're brushing your teeth or doing something really mundane, and you go ding, and I'm like, that's where. And yeah, so obviously the brain is also more than just like a updated version of Google.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, Ben, it's been an absolute pleasure, mate. Thank you so much for your time. I would say before you go, is there anywhere where people can follow you? Where, I mean, we've mentioned your podcast already, and we should definitely give that another plug, but where people can check you out, check out any short films and stuff you're going on about, I'd love to, and I'll put them in the show notes as well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so yeah, on Instagram, I'm Squaring the Circle Pod, which is about the podcast. My personal is Benjamin Film One, which isn't updated as much as I would like. And the website benjaminfilmphotography.co.uk.
Amazing. Well, listen, thank you so much, Ben. I can sort of mention that Ben's doing a really big cycle soon, so good luck with that, mate. And I would love to get you back on in the future at some point, and we can talk about some other films as well. But yeah, until then, mate, have yourself a good time, and I'll be seeing you soon. All right.
Thank you, mate. Take care.
Take care, buddy. All the best. Bye now.